73 wasn't the age to celebrate a birthday with much pomp, but tradition was tradition. Cornelius had insisted on a family dinner at the mansion, though for the past few years we'd limited ourselves to a modest dinner at a restaurant. Celeste had even brought a bouquet of white roses, my favorite, which was suspicious in itself, considering she usually gave me some cheap candles or synthetic scarves. I stood at the living room window, watching my son unload a few packages from the car. Cornelius had always been a sturdy man, but in his 48 years he had begun to get noticeably fat. His suit didn't fit as perfectly as it used to, and his hair had thinned noticeably at the top of his head. Celeste looked flawless as usual. Well-groomed shoulder-length hair, neat makeup, expensive dress. She was still an attractive woman at 42, though the coldness in her eyes spoiled the overall impression. I inherited the mansion from my mother, and she inherited it from her mother. A Victorian building from the 1890s, with high ceilings, moldings, and fireplaces in every room. 3 floors, 8 bedrooms, a library, a conservatory. It had once been a bustling place. I'd grown up surrounded by cousins and siblings who came for vacations. Now I kept most of the rooms closed, heating only the first floor and my bedroom upstairs. Mom, we brought everything for lunch. Cornelius brought the bags into the kitchen without waiting for an answer. Celeste made your favorite dish. That was weird, too. Celeste never cooked for family gatherings, preferring to order food from restaurants or buy it ready-made. And she didn't know my favorite dish, since she was never interested in such trivia. How nice of her. I walked into the kitchen, where Celeste was already pulling containers of food out of bags. What did you make? Grilled chicken with herbs and grilled vegetables. She didn't even look up as she transferred the food to my plate. I know you're health conscious. The kitchen in the mansion was renovated about 10 years ago. I'd invested a lot of money in it. New appliances, granite countertops, a spacious island in the middle. Celeste looked around with ill-concealed interest, as if assessing the value. Her gaze lingered on the Italian coffee machine and the built-in wine rack. I did prefer simple food to fatty dishes, but Celeste couldn't have known that. We'd never discussed my eating habits in the 15 years she'd been married to Cornelius. Our conversations were limited to polite phrases about the weather and mutual acquaintances. Sit down, Mom. Today's your day. Cornelius motioned to a chair by the dining room table. Celeste and I will organize everything. The dining room at the mansion had always been my pride. A solid oak table for 12, an antique sideboard with family china, and high windows overlooking the garden. Portraits of my ancestors looked out from the walls. Austere men in dark suits and women in dresses of bygone eras. My grandfather had built the first machine shop back in the 30s. My father had expanded the business after the war, and I had turned a small family business into 4 modern car services across Manchester. The table was set for 3 tonight, but the setting looked particularly festive. The finest plates, silverware, even candles and candlesticks. Celeste lit them theatrically, as if we were celebrating some historic event rather than an old woman's 73rd birthday. You've made a lot of effort. I sat down in my usual place at the head of the table. To what do I owe this attention? We just wanted to make it special. Celeste sat to my right, a smile on her face. You're the only mom we have. The only mom. That's funny. Celeste usually called me by my first name or avoided addressing me at all. Our mom sounded fake, like a cheap melodrama on TV. I noticed the new watch on her wrist, an expensive Swiss watch that definitely hadn't been there a month ago. Cornelius also looked more prosperous than usual. His job at the insurance company brought in a good income, but not enough to buy his wife a watch worth several £1,000s. By the way, Lillian, Celeste ran her hand across the polished surface of the table. I've been meaning to tell you what a lovely house you have. Such history, such atmosphere. Lillian. At least not Mom. That would have been too much, even for her. I was born Lillian Rose Harper, and when I married, I became Lillian Madison. My husband died 20 years ago of a heart attack, leaving me with a business, a house, and a son who thought the world owed him something. Thank you. I nodded. The house is really special. I wonder, she continued, how do you even maintain such a large building? There must be a lot of expenses. Heating, repairs, cleaning. I manage. I took a sip of water. The house is in good condition. Of course, Cornelius interjected. Mom was always practical. Do you remember, Celeste, when I told you how she'd taught herself how to change the wiring after the electrician had overcharged her? Yes, I remembered that time. Cornelius was in his early 20s, a university student who thought physical work was beneath him. But now, for some reason, he found the story amusing. Cornelius brought wine a good red, which I really liked. Another hit. Either they'd suddenly become incredibly attentive or they were preparing for something serious. The label said 1997, a great vintage, and the bottle was worth at least £100. To your health, Mother. Cornelius raised his glass. Here's to many years to come. To family, Celeste added, and her smile grew even wider. To everything we have in common. What unites us? Other than Cornelius, nothing brought us together. Celeste had never hidden the fact that she thought I was old-fashioned and too straightforward. I found her superficial and calculating. We kept up the pretense of a good relationship solely for the sake of our son. We had a drink. The wine was excellent. The chicken was really good, and the vegetables were cooked just the way I liked them, not overcooked, with a light crust from the grill. Celeste had either guessed or had made some inquiries somewhere, probably asked Cornelius, though I doubt he remembered such details. How's it going at the auto body shop? Cornelius asked, slicing the meat. Everything going well? Usually, I shrugged. There's plenty of work, especially at the inspection station. People can't do without cars. The main car service on Oxford Street was my special pride. State-of-the-art equipment, inspection license, skilled craftsmen. 3 other points smaller, but also profitable. One specializes in expensive cars, another on trucks, the third on ordinary repairs. Together they brought in a steady income, enough to maintain the mansion and save for a rainy day. Of course they can't, Celeste agreed. You've built a great business, Lillian. 4 locations around the city, that's serious. Compliments from Celeste? That's a little suspicious. In all the years I've known her, she's never shown any interest in my business, and now she's talking about it with such enthusiasm. Usually at the mention of car repair shops, she wrinkled her nose as if it were something unseemly. Times are changing, she continued, cutting off a piece of chicken. New technology, computerized diagnostics, internet advertising. It must be hard to keep up with it all. Not as hard as it seems. I took a sip of wine. I have good masters. They're up to date on everything. But still, Cornelius leaned toward me, his voice softer. Have you thought about putting the business in younger hands? A well-deserved vacation, travel, hobbies? That's it, a well-deserved vacation, putting the business in younger hands. I covered my eyes for a second, feeling a familiar wave of irritation rising inside. How many times in the last 5 years had Cornelius had this conversation? 10? 15? Each time I'd answered the same thing. I wasn't going to retire as long as I felt able to work. Cornelius, we've had this discussion. I set my glass down on the table a little more abruptly than I'd intended. I'm perfectly capable of handling the car service. Of course you are. He held up his hands in a conciliatory gesture. I'm just worried about your health. You're working from morning till night, constantly traveling between workshops. It keeps me in shape. And it was true. Despite my 73 years, I felt quite fit. Regular medical checkups showed that my health was fine, except for a little high blood pressure and arthritis in my hands. I drove a car, went shopping on my own, and climbed to the third floor of the mansion without shortness of breath. But think about the future, Celeste interjected, her voice soft but insistent. What's going to happen in 5, 10 years? Better to hand things over now while you can control the process than later in an emergency. Emergency order. So they're waiting for me to get so old I can't fight back, or get sick, or die. What a touching concern for my well being. I wonder how often they discuss it amongst themselves. Do they make plans for my inheritance every night at dinner? You know, Cornelius added, we could do this gradually. You stay on as a consultant, and we make the major decisions. No stress, no rush, counselor. Meaning I'll give advice they can ignore. Very convenient. Technically, I stay in charge, but in fact, I'm removed from the management. Naive kids think I don't understand their game. I'll think about it, I lied, smiling as fake as they did. But it's too early to talk about it. Of course, Cornelius nodded hastily. We just wanted you to know that if anything, we're ready to take that responsibility. Responsibility. How noble that sounds. Not take the lucrative business, but take responsibility. I wonder if they think I'm a complete fool, or if they're just so sure of their charm. After the main course, Celeste brought a cake, a small one, but clearly from an expensive pastry shop. She didn't put out 73 candles, limiting herself to 3 decorative ones. We sang a traditional song. I made a wish and blew out the candles. I wished for wisdom because I felt I would need it soon. By the way, Celeste said, cutting the cake, we wanted to ask about the business documents. Where do you usually keep them? The question sounded casual, but I could see Cornelius tense up as he waited for an answer. In the safe, I answered briefly. And if something happens, she continued, where will we find everything we need? The will, the property deeds, the bank papers. Celeste, Cornelius said sharply, you shouldn't talk about that on a day like this. No, she's right. I took a piece of cake. At my age, you should think about these things. I have a will, and you know where to find a lawyer. There really was a will. It was made 5 years ago, when I still believed Cornelius would grow up and become a worthy heir to the family business. A lot has changed since then in the way I view my son and his wife. It's good to know you've thought of everything. Celeste nodded with visible relief. And the code to the safe? Celeste! Cornelius blushed. I'm sorry, Mom. She didn't mean it. It's okay, I smiled. My lawyer knows the code. In case of an emergency. That's a lie. I was the only one who knew the code. But let them think the lawyers had it under control. It'll calm them down a little and give me time to prepare for their next move. We finished the cake while talking about the neighbors and the weather. Cornelius talked about his job at the insurance company, complaining about his new boss. Celeste nodded and glanced around the room from time to time, as if she were mentally arranging her furniture. You know, Mom, Cornelius said, leaning back in his chair. I've been thinking, what if we moved in with you? It's a big house, plenty of room for everyone. You wouldn't be alone, and we could help with the housekeeping. Here comes the second move. First the talk of transferring the business, now the offer to move in. That's very thoughtful. They want to be close by to control my every move. Move? I pretended to seriously consider the offer. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, Celeste said. We could take the second floor. It's got a couple of bedrooms, and it would make a great apartment. And you could stay on the first floor in your usual rooms. My usual rooms are on the first floor. How convenient. They'd lock me downstairs, and you'd run the place upstairs. The library, the guest bedrooms, my study, all of it would be their territory. I'll think about it. I repeated my favorite phrase of the day. I have to weigh everything. Sure, take your time. Cornelius reached for the bottle to refill it. But if you decide, we're ready tomorrow. Our apartment is too small for a family. A family? I wonder if they're planning kids or just want more space for themselves. Cornelius and Celeste had been married for 15 years, but they'd never had kids. Whether it didn't work out or they didn't want to, I never asked about such personal things. The clock on the mantel struck 8 in the evening. The birthday party was coming to an end, but I felt like the best part was yet to come. Cornelius and Celeste looked at each other more and more, and their smiles grew tenser. Something was going to happen, and I was ready for the unexpected. And now, Cornelius rose from the table and headed for his jacket hanging on the back of the chair. The best part. We have a special gift for you, Mother. Celeste stood up as well, and I noticed her nervously adjusting her dress. Whatever this gift was, they were both more excited than they were trying to show. Cornelius pulled a thick envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and placed it on the table in front of me. This is, he hesitated, searching for the right words. This is what we talked about your future, about your vacation, about you finally being able to live for yourself. The envelope was thick, clearly containing many documents. There was no writing on it, just my name, written in Cornelius's hand. I took my time opening it, studying the faces of my son and daughter-in-law. Celeste was biting her lip, a habit that betrayed her nervousness. Cornelius tried to look confident, but the sweat on his forehead said otherwise. Open up, Celeste urged me, her voice a little higher than usual. We tried very hard to prepare everything properly. I slowly opened the flap of the envelope and pulled out the first document, a deed transferring ownership of the mansion. In my name as the transferor, in Cornelius's name as the transferee. The date is today's date. It's all official, all legal, even had a notary stamp, which means they'd already taken care of it in advance. The next document was for the car dealerships. Transfer of all 4 locations, including equipment, licenses, and customer base. Then the bank paperwork on the change of ownership of the accounts, insurance policies, the deeds to the land under the main service on Oxford Street. Surprise! Celeste splashed her hands when I finished the last sheet. Now you're free of all worries. No taxes, no employee problems, no headaches with suppliers. Cornelius put his arm around my shoulders, and I could smell his cologne. An expensive cologne he hadn't used in a month. We've thought of everything, Mom. You're staying in the house, of course. It's just that technically it belongs to me now, and the business is the same. You can come and advise, but I make the major decisions now. You don't have to worry about anything anymore. I flipped through the documents a second time, reading the fine print. Everything was worded competently, with no obvious loopholes. Whoever their lawyer was, he knew his business. The clauses that I retained the right to live in the house for the rest of my life, but without the right to dispose of the property, were especially carefully spelled out. How long have you been preparing this? I asked, not raising my eyes from the papers. A few months, Cornelius answered honestly. We wanted to give you a real surprise. The lawyer said it was better to do everything at once so that there would be no problems later. And the power of attorney? I found the right document, the one I signed after I broke my leg. It authorizes me to act on your behalf in emergencies. Cornelius sat back down at the table, his voice more businesslike. The lawyer said it was enough to formalize the transfer of property if it was in the owner's best interest. In my best interest. That's a wonderful way of putting it. So they convinced the lawyer that the transfer of the property was for my welfare, not a broad daylight robbery. I wonder how much they paid him to interpret the law that way. But I had to sign these documents personally, I said, flipping through the pages. My signature is here, but I don't remember signing this one. Celeste and Cornelius looked at each other again. This time, it wasn't nervousness in their gazes, but something else. Satisfaction? Triumph? Remember a month ago when you signed the paperwork to renew the insurance on the house? Cornelius leaned toward me. There were several papers, and one of them was a form for a future transfer of ownership. Just in case. Just in case. So they'd already tricked me into signing documents I didn't know were there. They slipped the form among the insurance papers, knowing that I would not carefully read every line of the familiar forms. Very thoughtful of you. I put the documents back in the envelope. Now what? Now you rest. Celeste sat down next to me and took my hand. No morning trips to the service, no dealing with vendors, no tax problems. We're taking care of everything. Her hand was warm and soft, the hand of a woman who had never worked physically. Her fingernails were neatly trimmed and coated in ivory polish. On her ring finger was a diamond engagement ring, not a very large one, but a quality one. What if I wanted to change something in the house? I asked. Or sell some furniture? Well, technically, it's my house now. Cornelius shrugged. But we're a family. We can work things out, negotiate. So I'd have to ask for permission to make any changes to the house I'd lived in for almost 50 years. Where I grew up, where I married, where Cornelius was born, where I buried my husband. What about bank accounts? I pulled out another document. It says here that Cornelius takes over all your finances, but you'll be able to spend as much as you need. Celeste hastened to assure me. You just won't have to worry about budgeting and taxes and all that. Cornelius will give you a certain amount of money each month for personal expenses, a set amount, like an old age allowance, like a handout given out of charity. I wonder how much they think is enough for a 73-year-old woman who's been used to handling her own money all her life. How much? I asked bluntly. Cornelius hesitated, clearly not expecting such a question. Well, 500,000 a month? That would be enough for all your needs: food, clothes, medicine, some entertainment. 500 pounds a month, less than I spend on gas for my car, less than the heating bill for the mansion in winter. Apparently, they expect me to pay for the basics, food and utilities, and leave me pocket money for the little things. And the car? I nodded toward the window where my car was parked. Insurance, maintenance, gasoline. Mom, Cornelius leaned toward me with a look of concern on his face. You realize that at your age it's getting dangerous to drive. Your eyesight isn't the same. Your reactions are slower. My eyesight was fine. I'd had a checkup only 3 months before. My reactions were fine too. I hadn't had an accident in 10 years, not even a minor scratch. But Cornelius would rather think I was a decrepit old woman who couldn't drive. We could hire a driver, Celeste suggested, or you could use a cab. On us, of course. At their expense, of course. I mean, with money that was mine yesterday. How generous of them to spend my own money on my own maintenance. I see. I put the papers aside and stood up from the table. You've thought of everything. We've thought of your comfort, Mother. Cornelius stood up as well. We know how tired you are of all this business. Now you can do something you really enjoy. I wonder what they think I like. Knitting? Watching TV? Feeding pigeons in the park? They knew me so poorly they had no idea what I might be into besides work. When do you plan to move? I asked, returning to their offer to live together. If it's okay with you, it'll be next week. Celeste couldn't keep the enthusiasm out of her voice. We'd already started packing. Cornelius can take a vacation to help with the move. Already started packing. So they were sure their plan would succeed. They didn't think I could refuse or oppose it. Naive kids thought that signing a piece of paper automatically made me submissive. What about my personal belongings? I looked around the living room. Photos, books, china collection, everything stays where it belongs, Cornelius assured me. We're not barbarians. We'll just add a few things of our own. Celeste wants to put a piano in the living room. She recently started practicing music again. A grand piano in the living room. That means we'll have to take out the chairs or the couch to make room. Or maybe a rack of books. Gradually, my stuff will be supplanted by their stuff until there's no trace of the old furnishings left. Celeste plays the piano? I was surprised. I didn't know she had such a talent. I learned as a child, Celeste smiled. Then I quit, but now I've decided to go back to music. I'll have time for a hobby. Time for hobbies, because now she wouldn't have to work. The car service would bring in income, and she'd only have money to spend on her hobbies. I walked around the room, stopping at familiar objects. There was the chair my husband liked to sit in, reading the newspaper in the evenings. There's the dresser with family photos. Our wedding, Cornelius's birth, his graduation. There's the vase my mother brought back from Italy. All of this was now technically my son's. Mom, Cornelius came up behind me. I know this is a big change, but trust me, it's better for everyone. You deserve a peaceful old age. A peaceful old age. That sounds like a judgment, as if I'm no longer capable of active life, as if my time has passed. At 73, I feel full of energy, and they talk to me like I'm a profound invalid. What if I don't like something? I asked, turning to them. If I want it back? They looked at each other again. This time the expression on their faces was eloquent with both satisfaction and ill-concealed triumph. Mother, Cornelius said, the papers have been signed and certified. They are legally binding papers. Of course, you could theoretically change something, but why? We were acting in your best interests, in my interests. There's that wording again, so there's no going back, or almost none. Maybe a good lawyer could find loopholes in their scheme, but it would take time, money, and nerves. You're nobody here now, Celeste whispered so quietly I could barely hear her. What? Cornelius turned sharply to his wife. I said you're in no hurry to go anywhere now, Celeste repeated louder, but I heard what she said the first time. You're nobody here now. There it was, my sister-in-law's true attitude. No concern for my well-being, no desire to make my life easier, just cold calculation and a desire to get someone else's property, and I am nothing to them now, a superfluous person in my own home, living out my days on handouts. But they were wrong. They were seriously mistaken if they thought Lillian Madison would surrender without a fight. 3 days had passed since my birthday, and the mansion no longer felt like my home. Cornelius and Celeste moved in Monday morning with a van full of boxes and furniture. They took the master bedroom on the second floor, the same one where I'd lived with my husband for 20 years, where Cornelius had been born, where I'd spent sleepless nights after the funeral. Mom, we need to talk. Cornelius came down to the kitchen, where I was having my morning tea. He was wearing a house robe, an expensive silk one, clearly a new purchase. About your rooms. I looked up from the newspaper. Outside the window, the movers were unloading a large sofa from the van. Leather, modern, not at all in keeping with the Victorian style of the house. What's wrong with my rooms? You see, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. We need more space. Celeste wants to set up an office to work on interiors. She's planning to go into design. And I'm thinking about a home office to run the car service management. Cornelius has never worked in the automotive field. His experience was limited to insurance claims when he assessed damage after accidents. But now he saw himself as the manager of 4 workshops. So, what do you suggest? I asked, continuing to read a post about rising gasoline prices. There's a nice room on the first floor, next to the kitchen. It used to be a pantry, but we can remodel it. We'll put a bed, a closet, a little table. It'll be cozy and you'll be close to the kitchen. Convenient. Pantry. He suggested I move into the pantry. It was 3 by 4 meters, no window, one light bulb under the ceiling. I kept canned goods, old magazines, and gardening tools in there. But there's no window, I said. It's quiet, Cornelia shrugged. And you don't have to climb stairs. At your age, that's important. At my age. There it was again. As if being 73 meant being completely helpless and unable to climb the second floor. I've climbed those stairs every day for the last 50 years, and I wasn't going to stop. And the bathroom? I continued to ask practical questions. There's a small toilet under the stairs, and we can bathe in the main bathroom when we're not busy. Or we could put a shower in the basement. There's plenty of room there. The shower is in the basement. The toilet is under the stairs. Windowless room. They plan to turn me into a servant in my own house, putting me in the most uncomfortable corners. At that moment, Celeste walked in, dressed in a tracksuit and sneakers. Her hair was gathered into a ponytail, her face slightly flushed from exercise. "Good morning, Lillian." She headed for the refrigerator. "I was just upstairs looking around the rooms. We have so many plans. We could turn the library into a music lounge. It's got great acoustics. The library, the room where 3 generations of our family's books have been. Rare editions collected by my grandfather. Encyclopedias my father bought. The fiction I'd accumulated all my life. Now it was going to be a music room." "What about the books?" I asked. "Well, many are outdated." Celeste pulled a yogurt out of the refrigerator. "Who needs encyclopedias from the 1990s? It's all online now. We'll keep something valuable and donate the rest to charity. We'll donate it to charity." They were going to give away my decades-old collection as junk. First editions of classics, autographed books, rare art albums. All of it was trash in their eyes. "I want to turn the guest bedroom into a dressing room," Celeste continued, not noticing my silence. "Built-in closets, mirrors, an island for jewelry. Cornelius promised to hire a good crew. The guest bedroom where friends and distant relatives stayed, where my sister slept when she came from London, where Cornelius slept when he was sick as a child, and I sat beside him. Now it was to be the storage room for Celeste's dresses. Speaking of the crew, Cornelius finished his coffee and stood up. "I need to go to the main service, get to know the people, understand how everything is organized." The main service on Oxford Street had been running like clockwork for 15 years. I had a great team. Robert Taylor as chief mechanic, Gregory Smith as administrator. Ann Williams did the bookkeeping. They all knew their business and didn't need the supervision of a newcomer. "Robert Taylor can show you everything," I said. "He's been with us the longest." "Yes, yes," Cornelius nodded. "But I need to understand the processes myself. Maybe there's something that can be improved. Modernize, modernize." The auto shop was making a steady profit. The customers were happy. The employees were enthusiastic. But Cornelius needed to change something to justify his new position as owner. "Okay," I agreed. "Just let me know if you're planning any major changes." "Mom," he turned to me with a patient smile, "this is my business now. Of course I appreciate your experience, but I make the final decisions. My business." How easily he said it. The 4 auto repair shops I'd spent 20 years building had become his business in one signature on a document. After they left, I was alone in the house with the movers. They hauled boxes, furniture, paintings. Modern appliances were replacing old appliances. Leather furniture was replacing antique chairs. Abstract paintings replaced family portraits on the walls. By evening, the first floor was unrecognizable. There was a huge flat-screen TV in the living room, replacing a small old unit that suited me just fine. The sofa was exactly in the middle of the room, breaking the usual arrangement. The glass and chrome coffee table looked alien among the Victorian moldings. What do you think? Celeste returned with her purchases and surveyed the results of her work. It's much more modern, isn't it? It's a little out of place, I said honestly. You'll get used to it. She set the bags on the new coffee table. Change is always stressful, but it gets better. In the bags, I noticed expensive groceries, imported cheeses, red fish, French wines. Celeste used to buy such delicacies only for big holidays. Now, apparently, it had become a daily norm. Speaking of your room, she added, taking a bottle of champagne out of the bag. Cornelius has already made arrangements with the workers. They're going to start remodeling the storage room tomorrow. They'll put in a proper door, ventilate it, do some additional wiring. It'll be ready by the end of the week. By the end of the week. So I didn't have time to object. Decision made, workers hired, plans approved. My opinion was not taken into account. In the meantime, you can stay in the small guest room. Celeste continued. There's a single bed and a nightstand. It's enough for a temporary stay. The small guest room on the first floor was little bigger than a large closet. Friends' grandchildren used to sleep there when they came for the weekend. The bed was designed for a teenager. The ceiling was low, and one small window overlooked the wall of the neighboring house. The three of us ate dinner at the kitchen table, since the dining room was piled high with boxes. Celeste had made seafood pasta, a dish that was expensive and required some culinary skill. She used to make scrambled eggs or sandwiches at most. By the way, Cornelius poured himself some wine from an expensive bottle. I met Robert Taylor today. He's an interesting man, knows a lot about repairs. He's the best mechanic in Manchester, I agreed. Yes, but he's conservative. I suggested some ideas for expanding services, and he immediately started talking about the difficulties and risks. No willingness to change. Robert had worked in the automotive field for 30 years. He knew how to distinguish between reasonable ideas and ventures. If he expressed doubts about Cornelius's plans, then those plans were indeed dubious. What kind of ideas? I asked. For example, adding car tuning services. It's very popular now, installing spoilers, changing exhaust systems, chip tuning engines. Big money. Tuning required special equipment, trained craftsmen, safety certificates. It was a completely different field of activity, associated with additional risks and investments. And also, continued Cornelius, you can open a premium car wash. Not just a car wash, but a full service, dry cleaning, polishing, protective coatings. A premium car wash in the neighborhood where our main service was located would have been unprofitable. There were middle-class people living there who washed their cars themselves or used cheap self-service car washes. Robert's right, I said cautiously. Any expansion requires serious market analysis. Mom, Cornelius set his fork aside, you're thinking the old way. You have to take risks to make more profits. Standing still means falling behind the competition. Our competitors mostly offered the standard set of services, repairs, inspections, replacement of consumables, and they felt fine, judging by the workload of their workshops. There was no need for a car service revolution. After dinner, Celeste showed me pictures of the grand piano she was going to buy. White, glossy, the size of a small car. Half the living room had to be cleared out for it, removing the chairs and the book rack. It's a Boston grand piano, she explained, leafing through the catalog. Great sound, beautiful design. It'll be the centerpiece of the whole arrangement. The center of the composition in a house that until a week ago was mine. Where everything had a story, every object was connected to memories. Now it was going to give way to the piano of a woman who, for effect, had decided to remember her childhood music lessons. How much is it worth? I asked out of curiosity. 25,000, Celeste replied nonchalantly. but it's an investment in culture, in beauty. £25,000, more than I'd spent on personal expenses all year. But it wasn't my money now. It was Cornelius's money, formerly earned by the car services, which formerly belonged to him. Before going to bed, I walked through the house, saying goodbye to my familiar surroundings. On the second floor, workers had already begun clearing the library of books. Boxes of volumes stood in the corridor, waiting to be sent to charitable organizations. Among them, I noticed the first edition of Dickens, given to me by my husband for our 10th wedding anniversary. In the master bedroom, Cornelius and Celeste were organizing their household. Their clothes hung in the closet where my dresses used to hang. Their makeup and medications stood on the dressing table where I had once tidied up every morning. I went downstairs to the small guest room where I was to spend the next few days. The single bed creaked under my weight. The pillow was too thin, the blanket too light. The streetlight shone outside the window, and there was no way to draw the curtains completely. Lying in the dark, I listened to the new owners of my house walking around upstairs, how they were planning for tomorrow, discussing shopping, laughing about something. Their voices came through the ceiling, the contented, relaxed voices of people who had gotten what they wanted. But they were happy early. Too soon. The bell rang at 7:30 in the morning. I was already awake. Sleep came in bits and pieces in a strange bed, and the street lamp outside the window had been shining all night. The phone rang insistently, demandingly, and I realized it wasn't a random call. Cornelius came down the stairs in his pajamas and slippers, his hair disheveled, his face disgruntled. He clearly wasn't used to early calls and expected to sleep in until 8, as usual. Hello? He picked up the phone with irritation in his voice. Who is this? Yes, this is Cornelius Madison. I quietly left my room and walked to the kitchen, pretending I was going to have breakfast. In fact, I was extremely interested in hearing this conversation. My intuition told me that the call had to do with car services. What? Cornelius's voice changed dramatically, higher and more tense. Say that again, please. I didn't hear you. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing heavily, digesting the information he'd received. But how is it possible? He continued in a different tone of voice. No, wait, don't hang up. Explain to me in order what's going on. Another pause, an even longer one. Cornelius leaned against the wall in the hallway, his face gradually paling. The arrest of the accounts? He asked again. All the accounts? And on what grounds? At that moment, footsteps were heard from upstairs. Celeste, too, had awakened from her calls and was coming down to see what was wrong. She was in a silk robe. Her face without makeup looked tired and worried. What's going on? She whispered, approaching her husband. Cornelius waved his hand, showing that he could not answer yet. He listened to his interlocutor, occasionally inserting short lines. I see, I see. Yes, I'm the new owner. No, I didn't know about these obligations. The word obligations sounded particularly ominous. Celeste grabbed the staircase railing as if she felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Robert Kingsley? Cornelius interjected. Yes, that's our accountant. What about him? I quietly put the kettle on the stove and took out a cup, continuing to listen attentively. Robert Kingsley had been keeping accounts for all 4 car services for about 10 years, a reliable, tidy man who never made a mistake in his calculations. Equipment loans? Cornelius's voice became very quiet. How much? The longest pause followed. Cornelius sank slowly to the step of the stairs, the telephone trembling in his hand. £570,000? He spoke faintly. It's a mistake. It can't be that amount. 570,000. Celeste shook her hands and sat down next to her husband on the step. Their morning idol was crumbling before their eyes. But when were these loans taken out? Cornelius continued to inquire. Last month? Last month. I poured myself some tea and sat down at the kitchen table, where I could hear the conversation clearly. The picture was starting to become clearer, and I was curious how quickly they would realize the extent of the problem. What about the paperwork? Where are the signatures? Cornelius was clearly trying to find a loophole. The power of attorney. Yes, the power of attorney. I see. The same power of attorney I signed after I broke my leg. The one that authorized him to act on my behalf, and which I've used in recent months to apply for loans to modernize the equipment. And the suppliers? Cornelius's voice grew more and more desperate. What about the suppliers? Apparently, the accountant was telling him about the unpaid invoices for the new elevators in the main service, for the computer diagnostic system at the King Street branch, painting and refurbishment at the Church Lane workshop. 230,000? Cornelius repeated, and his voice trembled. Another 230,000 in debt to the suppliers? Celeste wrapped her arms around her head. Simple arithmetic showed that the total debt was approaching 800,000 pounds, more than all four car services combined were worth. And the taxes? Cornelius asked in a weak voice, as if he were afraid to hear the answer. The answer, judging by his reaction, was no less depressing. Cornelius closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wall. When do we have to pay? He whispered into the receiver. Today? What do you mean, today? Today. So there was no postponement. Banks and suppliers demanded immediate repayment of debts. Otherwise, the property of the car repair shops was subject to seizure and sale. Okay, I'll be right there. We need to sort this out. Cornelius hung up the phone and stared at his wife. Celeste, we have a problem. Serious problems. What kind of problems? She tried to remain calm. Explain to me properly what's wrong. The car service is in debt. Cornelius stood up and started walking down the hall. Huge debts, loans, suppliers, taxes, over 800,000 pounds. But how? Celeste stood up too. I mean, the business was profitable. Your mother always said it was doing well. I took a sip of tea and thought about how interesting it was to watch people who got what they wanted, but not what they expected. She's been taking out loans, Cornelius explained to his wife, in the last few months, for modernization, for new equipment. I saw these cars when I was at the main service station. New elevators, computers, tools. But why? Celeste didn't understand. Why take out loans like that? I don't know. Cornelia stopped in front of the hallway mirror and looked at his pale face. Maybe she wanted to increase the value of the business before the transfer, to give us a gift. A gift. How naive that sounded. They really believed I'd spent 800,000 pounds to do them a favor. And the money in the accounts? Celeste asked. The savings, the profits from the car service? The accounts are blocked, Cornelius replied grimly. Every single one of them. The banks had seized the assets until the loans were paid off. They stood in the hallway of the mansion, which formerly belonged to them, surrounded by expensive furniture, which they bought with my money, and realized that their dream was turning into a nightmare. Mom? Cornelius turned to me. Did you know about these loans? I looked up from the paper I was reading at breakfast. Of course I knew, I answered calmly. I applied for them. But why? He walked over to the kitchen table. Why take so much money? For business development? I shrugged. New equipment, renovation of premises, computerization. All of that requires investment. But why didn't you tell me that when you handed over the documents? Did you ask? I looked at him with an innocent look. It seemed to me that a serious businessman was studying the financial condition of the company he was going to head. Cornelius opened his mouth to object, but he couldn't find the words. Celeste stepped closer, her face a look of growing suspicion. Lillian, she said slowly, where is the money that was in the car service accounts? The profits from the last few years? What money? I wondered. Don't pretend, Cornelius said sharply. The car repair shops were generating income. Where did the savings go? I spent them, I answered honestly. On loans, on equipment, on repairs. And what was left, I transferred to another account. What other account? My personal account, I smiled. I have the right to dispose of my own money, don't I? There was silence. Cornelius and Celeste were digesting the information that there was no money, only debts and obligations. But how are we going to pay? Whispered Celeste. 800,000 pounds. We don't have that kind of money. What about the car services? Cornelius asked. Could we sell them? To whom? I laughed. Who would buy 4 car repair shops with debts exceeding their value? Even if you found a buyer, the money from the sale wouldn't be enough to pay off the loans. They stood in the middle of the kitchen and finally realized that they had inherited not a profitable business, but a financial disaster. The car dealerships were saddled with debt, accounts were blocked, and the only money was where they couldn't get to it. Mom, Cornelius' voice became pleading. You have to help. This is the family business. You can't leave us in this situation. Help? I finished my tea and got up from the table. What can I do to help? The business is yours now. You make the decisions. I'm just a pensioner living on 500 pounds a month. The mention of 500 pounds was particularly painful. They generously gave me that amount yesterday from the income of the car service, which, as it turned out, brought only expenses. Celeste gripped the edge of the table as if she felt dizzy. But there's a way out, she murmured. There has to be a way out. Of course there is, I agreed. You can declare bankruptcy. Then the property will be sold under the hammer, part of the debts will be written off, and the rest you will pay for years. Bankruptcy, a word that meant the end of all their plans. Instead of a lucrative business and a life of luxury, they'd end up with years of debt and a ruined credit history. And the house? Cornelius asked in a weak voice. Could the mansion be repossessed, too? It depends on what the loan agreements say, I answered. If the car dealerships were mortgaged against the loans, then yes, they could take all the related property. It was true. I had secured some of the loans against the real estate of the car dealerships, but 2 of the loans were secured by a mansion. The banks had the right to demand repayment of the debt by any means available. Cornelius collapsed in his chair and covered his face with his hands. Celeste looked silently out the window at the garden that seemed to be their garden just yesterday. I must go to the accountant, Cornelius said at last. I have to go to the accountant, Cornelius finally said. Of course, I nodded. Good luck with that. They left an hour later, both pale and confused. Celeste had forgotten to put on her makeup. Cornelius hadn't ironed his shirt. Yesterday's self-confidence evaporated, leaving only fear of an unknown future. And I was alone in a house that was technically theirs, but was actually becoming their prison, because pretty soon they'd have nowhere to run from the problems they'd brought upon themselves. Cornelius returned 3 hours later with the face of a man who had seen a ghost. Celeste was walking beside him, holding onto his arm as if she was afraid of falling. In her son's hands was a folder of papers that looked like a sentence. Mom, we need to have a serious talk. He placed the folder on the kitchen table and sat down across from me. We've been to the accountant. We've been through all the paperwork. Robert Kingsley, their accountant, was an honest and meticulous man. I was sure that he had given them a complete picture of the financial condition of the car services, without embellishing or hiding details. And what did they find out? I asked, continuing to knit the scarf I had started last winter. The debts are even bigger than we thought. Celeste sat down next to her husband, her voice shaking. £893,000, plus the interest that accrues every day. 893,000. I underestimated the total when I planned this operation. Apparently, the interest and penalties for late payments added a few tens of thousands more to the principal debt. Damn. But the worst part, Cornelius continued, opening the folder, is that the banks demand repayment within 30 days. Otherwise, they start the procedure of forced collection. 30 days, enough time to try to find a solution, but not enough time to change the situation dramatically. The banks weren't kidding when it came to that kind of money. And the suppliers are even worse, Celeste added. They gave us a week to pay the debt, and then they sue us. The suppliers of automobile parts and equipment couldn't afford the long waits. They themselves had obligations to manufacturers, banks, and employees. Every week of delinquency meant losses for them. We tried to find money in the company's accounts. Cornelius pulled bank statements out of a folder, but there's practically nothing there. I looked at the statements. The main account at the main car repair shop had £23 and 18 pence in it. The other workshops had even less, between £5 and £15. The rainy day money I'd been saving for years was gone. And where was the profit? Cornelius wouldn't stop. The service stations were working. The customers were paying. Where did the money from their work go? I explained. I repeated patiently. Spent it on business development. You don't just take out loans, you have to service them. But there had to be something left over. Celeste looked at me with despair. At least a little savings. Why would I leave money in the accounts of the company I was going to transfer? I wondered. That would be unwise from a tax point of view. Cornelius flipped through the documents nervously, looking for some clue. And your personal savings? He asked. You have personal savings, don't you? Of course I do, I nodded. But very little. You can't save much on a modest pension. It was true about the accounts they could find and check. My main bank account really only contained a few £1,000s, a reasonable amount for a pensioner. Mother, Cornelius leaned across the table to me, you must understand the gravity of the situation. If we don't find the money, we'll lose everything. The car service, the house, all the property. That's very sad, I agreed. But what can I do? I'm just a pensioner living on welfare. Don't pretend, Celeste snapped at me. You're hiding something. There's no way that in 20 years of work you've saved nothing. I put down my knitting and looked at them carefully. Celeste, are you accusing me of hiding money from my own family? That's exactly what I'm accusing you of. She straightened, her eyes glittering with anger. You purposely drove the car dealerships into bankruptcy to get back at us for something. Revenge. That's an interesting word. Like I should be avenging the fact that they swindled me out of my business and my home, turning me into a dependent in my own mansion. What was I supposed to avenge? I asked innocently. You were acting in my best interest, as you said yourself. Cornelius slammed his palm on the table. Mom, no more games. Where's the money? Do you have other accounts, deposits, endowments? I have a pension from the state, I answered honestly. £120 a week. It's barely enough for the bare necessities. And what was in the accounts of the car service before you started taking loans? Cornelius inquired. Working capital, I shrugged. Money for salaries, supplies, operating expenses. How much? I don't remember exactly. 70,000, maybe 80. 80,000 pounds. A substantial sum, but not enough to pay off a £900,000 debt. Cornelius gritted his teeth in disappointment. And you spent it all? On business development, yes, I confirmed. Is that a bad thing? I thought you'd be happy to get modernized car services. Celeste got up and started pacing around the kitchen, clearly trying to calm herself down. Lillian, she said, stopping in front of my chair, if you don't help us, we're going to lose everything. The house you've lived in for half your life, the car dealerships your father built, emotional impact, trying to play on my feelings about the family business and the family home. I wish they'd thought of that earlier when they were planning their coup. I understand, I nodded. But I repeat, I don't have that kind of money. How do we know you're telling the truth? Cornelius pulled out another document. We checked your bank accounts through the power of attorney. There's really almost nothing there. They checked my accounts. Of course they did. The power of attorney gave them that right, and they found exactly what I wanted them to find. Then what's the problem? I wondered. You made sure I wasn't lying. Dean, but there must be other assets, Cornelius persisted. Securities, deposits, real estate. What real estate? I laughed. The house is now yours. Car services are also yours. What else could I possibly have? Celeste turned to me abruptly. What if the money was transferred to accounts in other banks or in other countries? Smart girl, starting to think in the right direction, but still a long way from the truth. Other countries? I acted surprised. Celeste, you watch too many spy movies. Where would I get accounts in other countries? Switzerland, she said stubbornly, or islands in the Caribbean. You can hide money from taxes there. How would I get there? I laughed. At my age, with my health, I haven't been further than London in 5 years. That was true, too. I hadn't really traveled anywhere in recent years. But I've made extensive use of modern banking technology and financial advisors. Cornelius flipped through the documents again, as if hoping to find a clue that he had missed on first reading. The accountant said the strangest thing, he said slowly, that you had mentioned a niece in Canada several times in the last 6 months. A niece in Canada. Robert Kingsley was indeed an attentive man and memorized even passing references in conversations. So, what of it? I asked. Do you have a niece in Canada? I do, I nodded. My late sister's daughter, Emily, lives in Toronto, works as a doctor. Do you two keep in touch? Sometimes we write letters, I replied. At Christmas, birthdays, just the usual communication between relatives. Did you send her any money? Cornelius asked bluntly. Why? I wondered. She has a good job, her own family. She doesn't need help. Technically, that was true. Emily really didn't need my financial help, but she was willing to do a favor for her elderly aunt, especially when that favor promised her some future benefits. Mom. Cornelius stood up and walked to the window. We're in a desperate situation. If we don't find the money within a month, we'll be bankrupt. I'm sorry, I said sincerely, but I really can't help. I just don't have the means. Celeste suddenly stopped in the middle of the kitchen, as if a thought had occurred to her. What if we sold the house? She suggested it. The mansion is expensive. Maybe it would be enough to pay off the debts. That's a good idea, I agreed. Only the house is mortgaged against some of the loans. The banks have first right to the proceeds of the sale. That was true, too. 2 of the 5 loans were secured by the mansion. At the sale, the banks would be paid first, and the balance, if any, would go to the owner. But there would be something left, wouldn't there? Cornelius asked hopefully. Maybe, I shrugged, if you find a buyer willing to pay full price. Although the real estate market is not in the best shape right now. The real estate market in Manchester really wasn't doing so well, especially for big houses like our mansion. It was expensive to maintain, and there weren't many buyers. How much could the house be worth? Celeste asked. It's hard to say, I thought. Maybe 400,000, or maybe 350, depends on the buyer. Even 400,000 didn't cover the 900,000 owed, and with the banks taking their share, Cornelius and Celeste wouldn't have much left. They sat in my kitchen, in my house, studying the documents for my business, and realized that they had fallen into a trap from which there was no easy way out. Their dreams of a life with no money had crumbled like a house of cards. Tomorrow I'll call a realtor, Cornelius decided. I'll find out the market value of the house. That's a good idea, I said. The sooner you start the selling process, the better chance you have of finding a buyer before the bank terms expire. They went upstairs, leaving me alone with a folder of papers on my desk. I flipped through the papers, checking to see if I'd missed something in my calculations. No, everything was right. The car service had become a financial bomb, and my dear relatives had received it as a birthday present. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in the house had heated up to the max. Cornelius spent all day on the phone, calling realtors, lawyers, and bankers. Celeste was scurrying around the house, either sitting at the computer, researching real estate sales, or grabbing a calculator, trying to find a way to cover her debts. We had dinner in silence. Celeste cooked a simple pasta, a far cry from the elaborate dinner she'd enjoyed with her husband in the first days after the move. Expensive groceries suddenly seemed an inappropriate luxury when the family was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. I've talked to 3 realtors, Cornelius finally said, setting aside his fork. The valuation of the house ranges from 320 to 380,000 pounds. 380,000. Less than I'd anticipated, but within reason for the current market. Big houses like this were not selling well in Manchester. Too high maintenance costs were discouraging buyers. And the timing of the sale? Celeste asked. 3 to 6 months, Cornelius replied grimly. If we're lucky, and we have only a month before the bank demands. A month. Even if there was a buyer tomorrow, it would take at least 6 weeks to finalize the deal. And banks aren't known for their patience when it comes to overdue loans. We could try a quick sale, Celeste suggested. For less, but faster. How much less? Cornelius asked. 250, maybe 270,000, she answered uncertainly. Even 270,000 didn't solve the problem. After the liens were paid off, the banks would have very little left, not enough to cover the rest of the debts. It won't help anyway. Cornelius rubbed his forehead with his hand. The debt is too big. I finished my portion and put the plates neatly in the dishwasher. The sun was setting outside the window, coloring the garden with golden hues. I had planned this garden in the spring, planting roses in the summer, removing leaves in the fall. Now I was to watch my own son sell it. Mom, Cornelius turned to me, we need to have a serious talk. About what? I asked, even though I knew exactly where he was going with this. About the money, about where it really is. We've had this conversation before, I reminded him. I don't have the money to solve your problems. Celeste stood up abruptly from the table and stared at me with ill-concealed anger. Stop lying, she shouted. We know you're hiding something. Celeste, I said softly, you don't have to raise your voice. We're civilized people. Civilized? She laughed hysterically. A civilized woman wouldn't drive a family business into bankruptcy because of personal revenge. Revenge. There's that word again. I wonder what they considered revenge. The fact that I didn't let them rob me easily, or the fact that I made them accountable for their greed. I don't understand what revenge you're talking about, I replied calmly. I handed over the business and the house to you as you asked. Along with the debts, Cornelius shouted. You took out loans on purpose to bankrupt us. I modernized the car service, I explained patiently. I bought new equipment, made repairs. Is that bad? For 800,000 pounds? Cornelius couldn't believe it. No modernization is not worth that kind of money. In fact, the modernization really cost about 300,000 pounds. The other 500,000 I spent on other things, but they didn't need to know that. Modern equipment is expensive, I shrugged, especially if you buy it all at once for 4 workshops. Celeste gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white with tension. Lillian, she said through gritted teeth, if you don't tell us where the money is, we're going to lose everything, including this house. That's very sad, I agreed. But what can I do? You can stop pretending. Cornelius exploded. We're not idiots. A profitable business doesn't go bankrupt in a few months. Why not? I wondered. It's enough to take out a few large loans and spend the money. Many companies go bankrupt just like that. But why? He didn't understand. Why would you do that? To grow the business, I repeated for the third time that day. I thought you would appreciate my efforts. Cornelius stood up and paced the kitchen, clearly trying to control his emotions. Mom, stop this game, he said, stopping in front of me. We know you're a smart woman, too smart to accidentally ruin your own business. Thanks for the compliment, I smiled. But mistakes happen even to smart people. It's not a mistake, Celeste shouted. This is a planned operation. You deliberately planted a bomb under the inheritance. A bomb under the inheritance. A poetic definition, but technically inaccurate. No one forced them to claim the inheritance. They insisted on receiving the inheritance while I was alive. Celeste, I said patiently, no one forced you to take over the auto services. It was your decision. Our decision? She laughed. You said yourself that you were tired of the business. You were the one who hinted at handing over the business. Hinted? I was surprised. When? All the time. Cornelius joined his wife. For the last 5 years, you've been talking about taking a well-deserved vacation. I have, I agreed, but I never asked you to take my business. It was your initiative. They looked at each other, realizing I was right. They were the ones who had insisted on the paperwork, the ones who claimed to be acting in my best interests. But you didn't object, Cornelius said weakly. Why should I? I shrugged. You're adults. You're responsible for your own decisions. Celeste stepped toward me, her face flaming with anger. Where's the money, you old witch? She hissed. We know you have it, old witch. So much for my dear daughter-in-law's true feelings. No more mama or caring smiles. Celeste, I said calmly, you're forgetting yourself. This is my house after all. Your home? She laughed angrily. Your house? It belongs to my husband. And if we lose it because of your games, you'll be on the street. Threats. Now they were moving on to direct threats. I wonder how far they are willing to go in their desperation. I see, I nodded. So you'll kick me out of the house if I don't give you money I don't have. Exactly, Cornelius confirmed. And not just kick you out, we'll sue you for fraud. What fraud? I wondered. Hiding assets, Celeste blurted out. For misrepresenting the transfer of assets. But I didn't hide anything, I objected. All the documents were in the public domain. You could have examined the financial condition of the car service centers before signing. You deceived us, Cornelius insisted. Day. Presented a loss-making business as a profitable one. When? I asked. Show me a document where I guaranteed profitability, or a recording of a conversation where I promised a cloudless future. They were silent, realizing that there were no written guarantees on my part. I was just keeping them from making plans for my inheritance. You took advantage of our trust, Cornelius accused me. Your trust? I grinned. You tricked me into signing the documents by hiding them among the insurance papers. Who tricked who? A direct hit. Cornelius blushed, remembering exactly how they got my signature on the property transfer documents. It, it was necessary, he mumbled. For your own good. For my own good? I laughed. Taking away my home and my business, putting me on welfare and locking me in a closet is for my own good? We wanted to make your life easier, Celeste insisted. That's very nice of you. I nodded. Now you have a chance to appreciate how easy my life has become. Cornelius sank back in his chair, realizing the futility of further accusations. Mom, he said more quietly, if there's really nothing you can do to help, we'll all go broke. I know, I agreed. It's a shame. And you don't feel sorry for the family business? Celeste asked. The business your grandfather and father built? Emotional pressure, trying to make me feel guilty for the failure of the family business. Of course I'm sorry, I answered honestly. But the family business stopped being a family business the moment you decided to remove me from management. We didn't. Cornelius was indignant. We offered to keep you on as a consultant. Non-voting consultant, I clarified. A very honorable position. Celeste grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. Lillian, she whispered, I know you've hidden the money somewhere. Tell me where, and we'll forget all the hard feelings. What grudges? I was surprised. Do you have any grudges against me? You, she shouted, you have a grudge against us for wanting to help. Help. By taking my home and business, they wanted to help me. Amazing logic. I don't have a grudge against you, I said calmly. I have something else. What? Cornelius asked tensely. A notion of justice, I replied. You got exactly what you wanted. Enjoy the result. The month went by quickly. Cornelius and Celeste flitted between banks, lawyers, and realtors, desperate to find a way out of the financial hole they'd fallen into. But time was working against them. Each day of delinquency added more interest and penalties to the debt. The first to fail were the suppliers of automotive equipment. On Monday morning, 2 truckloads of bailiffs pulled up to the main service on Oxford Street. They sealed off the brand new elevators, the computerized diagnostic system, and all the expensive tools I'd bought in recent months. Mom, they're taking the equipment. Cornelius stormed into the house in the afternoon, face red with anger and humiliation. Like barbarians, they didn't even let me explain the situation. The bailiffs acted strictly according to the law. A debt of £230,000 to suppliers gave them the right to seize goods supplied on credit. Computer equipment, hoists, special tools, all could be sold at auction to partially cover the debt. And the laborers? I asked. What about the employees? Robert Taylor is trying to explain something to the bailiffs, but it's no use. Cornelius collapsed in his chair. Without equipment, the service cannot work. We'll have to send people on leave at their own expense. A furlough meant a de facto dismissal. Skilled mechanics wouldn't wait indefinitely while their employer solved the financial problems. They would find positions at other shops, and Madison's auto service would lose its most valuable asset, experienced staff. Celeste hadn't left her room all day. Yesterday, she'd learned that the piano she'd dreamed of would no longer be delivered. The seller had canceled the order when it became clear that the buyer couldn't guarantee payment. £25,000 for the instrument seemed too risky an investment for a family on the brink of bankruptcy. On Tuesday, it was the bank's turn. A representative of the Royal Bank of Scotland, an elegant middle-aged woman in a smart suit, handed Cornelius a formal notice of foreclosure. Mr. Madison, she said, sitting in our living room, you have 7 days to voluntarily repay the debt. After that, the bank will proceed to foreclosure. The mortgaged property included the mansion and 2 of the 4 auto repair shops. The other workshops were burdened with loans from other banks, which were also not going to wait longer than the deadline. What if we sold the house ourselves? Cornelius asked. Find a buyer and get the market price. 7 days, repeated the bank representative. If the debt is paid in full within that time, £423,000 with interest, the bank will remove the encumbrances. Otherwise, the property will be taken over by the bank. 423,000 in 7 days. Even if the house had been sold for the minimum price, it would have taken weeks to complete the transaction. The banks were well aware of this, setting obviously impossible conditions. On Wednesday, the appraiser's car arrived at the house. 3 men in blue coveralls went around the mansion with tape measures and tablets, photographing every room, every piece of furniture. They were compiling an inventory of the property for later auction. A Victorian mahogany sideboard, the senior appraiser dictated, surveying the dining room. The approximate value is between £1.5 and £2,000. I inherited this sideboard from my grandmother. Its drawers held 3 generations of family photos, letters, documents. Now it has become lot number 17 for an estate auction. The piano is not to be appraised, the female appraiser remarked. The inventory says the delivery has been canceled. And the books? The young assistant asked, pointing to the library. Ordinary books are not included in the lots, answered the senior, unless there is something particularly valuable. First edition of Dickens and autographs of contemporary writers remained unnoticed among the mass of volumes. The appraisers were not experts in antiquarian books and had missed a few really expensive copies. Cornelius followed on their heels, asking pointless questions about deadlines and procedures. Celeste locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out, even when the appraisers knocked on the door. Mr. Madison, the senior appraiser explained patiently, you can take your personal belongings, clothes, documents, pictures of the family. Everything else stays for sale, personal effects, clothes, and photographs. From the house where I had lived for half a century, they were allowed to take what would fit in 2 suitcases. On Thursday, Cornelius received a notice from the IRS. They weren't left out of the property division either. The car services owed the Treasury £47,000 in income tax and VAT for the last quarter. Where did that amount come from? He wondered, studying the documents. We haven't made a profit yet. Taxes were based on turnover, not profit. During the last months of my management, the car services were working actively, fulfilling orders and conducting technical inspections. Revenues went to the company accounts, and I carefully transferred them to other purposes, not saving for tax payments. Mom? Cornelius turned to me. You knew about the tax liability, didn't you? Of course, I nodded, continuing to read the detective novel. Taxes are an inevitable part of any business. But why weren't they paid? The money was used for development, I shrugged. You can't modernize equipment and pay all the taxes at the same time. The logic was flawless. Every entrepreneur faces a choice between current payments and investments in the future. I chose to invest, though not in the car service, but in my own future. On Friday, a large truck with the logo of the auction house Northern Auctions pulled up to the house. Workers began taking out furniture, paintings, dishes, everything in the appraiser's inventory. Celeste stood at the bedroom window and cried as they took out the leather sofa they'd paid £5,000 for 2 weeks ago, the huge screen TV, the modern coffee table, the expensive lamps. All their purchases were being turned into auction lots. Can we buy something back at auction? Cornelius asked the auction house representative. Of course, he smiled. The auction is open, anyone can bid. And if we were the owners of these things? No advantage, shook his head representative. The law is the law. If you want to buy, come with money like everyone else. Money. The one thing they didn't have and didn't expect to have in the near future. Cornelius worked for an insurance company as a middle manager. His salary was about £3,000 a month. Celeste did not work anywhere, living on her husband's income. This money was enough to live modestly, but not to attend auctions of expensive furniture. On Saturday, they began packing personal belongings. 2 suitcases and a few bags were all that remained from their move to the mansion. Celeste folded dresses that she bought in expensive stores, counting on a trouble-free future. Cornelius packed documents and a small collection of watches, the only valuables he had managed to keep. "Where are we going?" Celeste asked, closing the last suitcase. "To your mother's for now," Cornelius answered. "To Liverpool. We'll spend the night and think about what to do next." Celeste's mother lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Liverpool. 2 rooms, tiny kitchen, one toilet. After the mansion, it felt like a prison cell, but there was no choice. "How long for?" Celeste kept asking. "I don't know," her husband replied tiredly. "Until I find a new job. The insurance company fired me. They didn't want to keep a bankrupt employee. Firing me was a logical step. Insurance companies valued their reputation and couldn't afford managers with questionable financial histories. Customers should trust the people who advise them on money matters. On Sunday, they left the mansion. Cornelius loaded his belongings into the car, the same car that was also soon to go to auction to cover debts. "Goodbye, Mom," he said, hugging me on the doorstep. "I hope you're happy with the result." "The result of what?" I wondered. "Your revenge," he said quietly. "You got what you wanted." "I only wanted one thing," I said, looking into his eyes, "that you get what you deserve." Celeste walked past me without saying a word. Her face was so hateful, I felt a chill. But revenge is a bad counselor, especially when you don't have money, influence, or opportunity. The car disappeared around the corner, and I was alone in the empty house. The workers had already taken out almost all the furniture, and the walls seemed bare of paintings and photographs. The echo of footsteps reverberated off the ceiling, creating a strange atmosphere of abandonment. But the loneliness did not last long. Half an hour later, a bank representative arrived with the keys to the new lock. The mansion was officially in the hands of the creditors until it was sold at auction. "Mrs. Madison," he said politely, "you have 1 hour to pack. The bank will give you temporary lodging in a hotel for 3 days. 3 days in a hotel at the bank's expense, a display of corporate humanity. After that, I had to work out my own housing problems on a state pension of £120 a week. I packed a small bag with the essentials: documents, medicines, a few sets of clothes. There was nothing else to take. Almost all my possessions had become part of the auction lots. As I left the mansion, I looked back at the home of my childhood, youth, and mature years, a beautiful building that would soon become the property of an unknown buyer. The new owners would be setting up a new life here, unaware of the dramas of the previous owners. But I had no time for sentimentality. New tasks lay ahead, and the most difficult of them all was to find a permanent home with the modest funds that the banks had failed to discover and seize. The apartment on Maple Street was small but cozy. 2 rooms on the second floor of an old brick house, a kitchen the size of a pantry, a bathroom with a shower cubicle. £700 a month was a reasonable price for downtown Manchester, especially since I could afford much more than £700. The landlady, Mrs. Patel, was a pleasant woman in her 60s. She'd been renting the apartment for 5 years, the previous tenants having moved out because they'd moved to another city. It was a bit of luck to find a decent place to live for reasonable money in a good neighborhood. "Are you a senior citizen?" she asked, looking at my papers. "Yes," I nodded. "I'm a widow, my children are grown, and I live separately." "Any references from your previous place of residence?" "Unfortunately, no," I answered honestly. "I lived in the family home, which I had to sell." Mrs. Patel nodded understandingly. She knew the story of elderly people forced to sell large houses after the death of their spouses. Many of her tenants were in a similar situation. And the income? She asked delicately. I have to make sure you can make regular payments. A pension plus a little help from relatives abroad, I explained. That adds up to about £1,200 a month. £1,200 sounded pretty convincing for a woman of my age. Not luxury, but enough to rent a decent apartment and live without too many restrictions. Relatives in Canada? Mrs. Patel asked, noticing the Canadian bank on the income statement. A niece, I confirmed. She's a doctor, lives in Toronto. She helps an elderly aunt. Emily did indeed work as a doctor in Toronto. A smart, educated woman in her 40s who understood the benefits of working with her wealthy aunt in England. The monthly transfers of £1,000 looked like help to a relative, but in fact, they were a return of my own money through a Canadian trust. The move took one day. I had no furniture, just a suitcase of clothes and a box of papers. Mrs. Patel allowed me to use the previous tenant's furnishings, simple furniture, necessary appliances, utensils, nothing superfluous, but everything functional. I spent the first few weeks settling into my new life. Registration with the local doctor, registration of benefits for pensioners, getting acquainted with neighbors, the usual worries of an older woman starting from scratch at 73. The money came in regularly, every 2 weeks. The transfers from Canada went through the international banking system and looked perfectly legal. The tax authorities couldn't pick on help from overseas relatives, especially if the amounts were reasonable. A month after the move, I happened to meet Robert Taylor, a former chief mechanic from a car service center on Oxford Street. He was coming out of the grocery store carrying heavy bags, looking tired and aged. Mrs. Madison. He was surprised to recognize me. How are you? Where do you live? I rent an apartment nearby, I said. How are you? Have you found a new job? Robert shook his head. I'm still working part-time in small workshops. I can't find a normal place. They all require references, and our service closed so suddenly that no one can explain anything. The closure of car services did happen abruptly. It was impossible to work without equipment, and buying new equipment was too expensive for a bankrupt business. The banks sold the premises together with the remaining property, but the new owners have not yet decided what to do with the real estate. And the other guys? I asked. Gregory, Ann? Gregory got a job as a dispatcher for a transportation company. It's less money, but it's something. Ann is staying home for now. The accounting jobs are all taken, and not many people take them at her age. The qualified employees suffered from the decisions of their former owner. They did their work honestly, unaware of the financial games of the management, and had to pay for it by losing their places and difficulties with employment. By the way, Robert leaned toward me, lowering his voice. What about your son? They say he's been missing since the bankruptcy. Cornelius lives in Liverpool, I answered neutrally, with his wife's relatives. It must be hard on him. Robert shook his head. Such a blow to his ego, first to become the owner of 4 services, and then to lose everything in a month. Robert genuinely sympathized with my son, a simple, honest man who could not imagine the complex family intrigues and saw only the surface of events. A young entrepreneur received an inheritance and failed to manage. 2 months later, I learned more details about the fate of Cornelius and Celeste. The information came from a neighbor, Mrs. Collins, who loved to gossip and knew everyone and everything about everyone in our neighborhood. Do you know what happened to your son? She asked when she met me in the hallway. A friend of mine lives in Liverpool, saw them there. Saw what? I asked, pretending not to be too curious. They live with her mother-in-law in a one-room apartment. Mrs. Collins shook her head pityingly. They sleep on a fold-out couch, and his wife can't find a place to work. They're down on their luck, they say. A one-room apartment for 3 adults. Celeste, accustomed to luxury and comfort, mother-in-law, who has lived modestly all her life, and Cornelius trying to find a job with a ruined reputation. It's an explosive mix. What about the debts? I asked. The banks were demanding repayment. Oh, so it's a separate story. The neighbor revived. They declared bankruptcy. The court recognized them insolvent. Now the debts have been partially written off, and the rest will be paid for 15 years. In small installments, 15 years of payments. Cornelius is 48, so he'll be paying off his creditors until he's 63. Celeste is 42, so she'll pay up to 57. The most productive period of their lives will be spent under the weight of debt. Had your house been sold? Mrs. Collins continued to inquire. It was sold, I confirmed, at auction. Some family from London bought it. How much, if it's no secret? 290,000, I replied. Below market value, but there weren't many buyers. 290,000 pounds. Cornelius had about 50,000 left after the bank deposits were paid off. Not a bad sum to start a new life, but he'd spent it on lawyers who were trying to dispute the debts and on running costs in the first months after the bankruptcy. In the winter, I received a letter from Emily, a short, formal message that things were going well in Canada. The family was healthy and work was satisfying. Between the lines was a question. Was everything okay with our financial arrangements? I answered equally briefly, saying that I felt fine. The apartment was comfortable, and money was coming in regularly. The transfers from Canada provided me with a comfortable life, and the trust in my niece's name protected the capital from any encroachment. In the spring, I had an encounter I hadn't expected. Celeste stood at the entrance to the same grocery store where I bought my weekly groceries. She was thin, poorly dressed, her eyes faded. It was hard to recognize her as the beautiful woman she once was. Lillian, she called to me as I passed. Celeste, I nodded. How are you? How are you? She laughed bitterly. Fine. 3 of us living in a room, me washing dishes at the cafe for minimum wage, Cornelius delivering pizzas on his motorcycle, washing dishes and delivering pizzas. From insurance executive and upper middle class housewife to laborer in a year and a half. That's an impressive career trajectory. I'm sorry to hear that, I replied neutrally. Sorry? Celeste stepped closer, a familiar note of anger in her voice. You're not sorry at all. You got what you wanted. What I wanted? I wondered. Revenge, ruin our lives, turn us into beggars. Passers-by began to turn around at the raised voices. Celeste paid no attention, completely absorbed in her rage. Celeste, I said calmly, you chose your own path. No one forced you to take my business. We wanted to help, she screamed, to make your old age easier. Thank you, I nodded. My old age had indeed been made easier. No more worrying about taxes, employees, and suppliers. Where did you get the money for this apartment? Celeste squinted at me. For new clothes? For proper food? You only have a pension. Help from relatives, I explained. My niece in Canada sends me small sums. You're lying, Celeste shouted so loudly that several passers-by stopped. You hid our money somewhere. Our money. That's an interesting way of putting it. The money earned by my car service over 20 years. She considered it hers. Celeste, I said patiently, your life is the result of your own decisions. If you don't like it, change it. How? She grabbed my sleeve. Change it how? We're in debt up to our eyeballs. We can't get decent jobs. Work hard, I said. Save money. In 15 years, we'll be out of debt. 15 years, Celeste howled. We'll be in our 40s. We'll be a wreck by then. Maybe, I agreed, but it's your choice and your responsibility. I carefully freed my sleeve from her fingers and headed toward the store. Celeste remained standing on the sidewalk, staring at me with an expression of impotent hatred. In the evening, sitting in my cozy apartment with a nice cup of tea, I thought about justice. Cornelius and Celeste got exactly what they asked for: my business and my home. True, it came with debts they preferred not to find out about in advance, and I got what I deserved after half a century of honest labor: a peaceful old age without the worries of greedy relatives. The money I had earned now provided me with comfort rather than financing other people's whims. Outside the window, the trees were blooming, heralding the arrival of a new spring, the first spring of my truly free life.